Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Shakir Kaufman, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 16 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 16. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. Before we get into today's episode, a reminder, if you're looking for a specific running back, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you appreciate the content and of course the timestamps, be sure to click the like button. And if you have to do so, of course, subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular goal of trying to help you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, so let's talk about running backs, beginning with matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 running back rushing statistics allowed between the spectrum of time between weeks 5 through 15. And I'm isolating specifically running back rushing statistics. So regardless of what scoring format you play in, whether it's a half PPR, standard, full PPR, we have an idea as to which running backs have the most advantageous matchup going into the given week based on rushing yards and rushing touchdowns allowed. The Arizona Cardinals, Indianapolis Colts, Carolina Panthers, Seattle Seahawks, New York Giants, etc. are the most advantageous matchups going into the given week, and we of course want to take advantage of them. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have some of the more difficult matchups. Teams like, the Houston Texans, since week 5, are only allowing 2.85 yards per carry to opposing running backs. Obviously, the efforts of Derrick Henry last week certainly skewed the numbers into that direction, but nonetheless, they have played extremely well in terms of stopping the run. I wanted to go ahead and present this information to you guys, as I will be referring back to it over the course of today's episode, because the efforts of the 11 other defenders on the opposite side of the field certainly impact the potential success and or failures of our fantasy prospects as we approach a given week, so we want to take these into account. Now, with this all covered, let's go ahead and transition into our top 36 running back rankings. Again, a reminder, rankings are subject to change. Over the course of today's episode, you're going to see players like Josh Jacobs, Isiah Pacheco, and Jonathan Taylor all ranked, under the assumption that they're going to be active, healthy, and playing this week. Now, if these players are not available by the time we get to Saturday, Sunday, or Monday's games, of course, the rankings will adjust. So again, rankings always subject to change. Be sure to swing on by for our upcoming live streams this upcoming weekend, or you can go ahead and check out Underdog Fantasy down in the description. When you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only do you get the first-time deposit match up to $100, you'll get my rankings sent to you this upcoming Saturday and Sunday morning. These include by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and of course, flex rankings, half PPR and full PPR. To take advantage of the opportunity, you have to be eligible based on your current location. Check out the map to the right side of the screen. And if you sign up before Thursday's game between the Los Angeles Rams and New Orleans Saints, you can take advantage of the new customer special of 0.5 total yards for Matthew Stafford. Thank you very much for all the support and using code Andrew. All right, let's talk about the running back position, beginning with, of course, the running back that needs to be at the very top of this conversation every single week, Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers, coming off an incredible 39.2 half PPR fantasy point performance. Another game in which he scored 3 or more touchdowns against the Arizona Cardinals. That was the expectation, and he'll continue to succeed regardless of what defense he's taking on. They take on the Baltimore Ravens this upcoming week, and quite frankly, it doesn't matter. We're firing up Christian McCaffrey, a running back who's currently averaging 21.15 half PPR fantasy points per game. He is tied with Raheem Mostert in terms of most running back touchdowns scored this season with a total of 20. Moving on to our number 2, we have Kyren Williams, who takes on the New Orleans Saints on Thursday Night Football. Yes, it is going to be a short week, but the matchup against the New Orleans Saints does not instill fear in me and the potential of Kyren Williams, especially considering what we have seen as of late. Since returning from the injured reserve, from weeks 12 through 15, he's been the number 3 overall running back in terms of fantasy points per game, averaging 22.23 fantasy points per game. In the last 4 games, he has garnered 106 total touches. That's either rushing attempts and or receptions. He continues to see himself a high volume of overall snaps, touches, and finds himself in the end zone quite often. Of course, an automatic play as our number 2. Our number 3 is Rachaad White, who continues to ball out every single game. Over the course of the last 7 games in which he has participated in, he has scored 7 total touchdowns. He's averaging 18.43 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time, and a lot of it has to do with the volume of opportunity he has been given. He has been given 20 or more overall rushing attempts in 5 of those 7 games he has played. He's been able to surpass over 100 total yards in 5 of those last 7 games. Of course, the opportunity is there. He is the lone back. Unimpeded opportunity of volume is all we can ask for at the running back position. And as long as he continues to find the end zone, he should be a fantastic play this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. On number 4 for this week is the thumbnail of today's episode, James Cook. James Cook has been dominating ever since we have seen the offensive coordinator change from Ken Dorsey now to, of course, Joe Brady. A couple years back, Joe Brady was the offensive coordinator for the Carolina Panthers. He allowed that offense to excel. And now that he has taken over for the Buffalo Bills, that's exactly what we're seeing from James Cook. He is excelling. He is being given and granted opportunity that he wasn't receiving earlier on in the season. Over the course of weeks 11 through 13, since we have seen the change of this offensive coordinator, James Cook has been the number 3 overall running back in terms of fantasy points per game, only behind Christian McCaffrey and Kyren Williams. He has totaled 564 yards, 4 total touchdowns in the last 4 games, and is averaging 22.1 half PPR fantasy points per game. He has produced a top 10 fantasy performance in 3 of the last 4 games he has played with the new offensive coordinator, and I don't think it's going to slow down this week, taking on the Los Angeles Chargers, who couldn't stop a soul last week. On number 5 is Raheem Mostert, the running back that is tied with Christian McCaffrey for most touchdowns scored by a running back this season with a total of 20. Of course, set franchise records. Of course, throughout his entire career prior to this season, Raheem Mostert didn't even have 20 total touchdowns. Yes, that is a legitimate stat. If you go ahead and look at his entire career, not including the postseason, he had only scored 19 total touchdowns, 14 on the ground, 5 through the air, throughout his entire career prior to this season. Now he has 20 in just 1 season. Nonetheless, he continues to ball out every single week. He has scored 2 touchdowns in 3 of the last 4 games he has played. And of course, we have seen Devon Achane active in a lot of those games. Regardless of Devon Achane's overall presence and usage, we are seeing that Raheem Mostert is clearly the RB1 of this team, continues to dominate in terms of overall rushing attempts and goal line work, which of course are the most valuable touches within this backfield, especially considering how high scoring of an offense they are. They have the privilege of taking on the Dallas Cowboys this week at home. The Dallas Cowboys just got ran through by James Cook, who we just mentioned just earlier, who went for 179 yards in a monster game. But the entire Buffalo Bills running backs combined for 39 carries, 244, and 2 touchdowns. I would assume that Raheem Mostert and this offense will be able to take advantage of the opportunity. On number 6, to begin the B tier, is Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon has the privilege of taking on a division rival in the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, just a couple weeks back in week 12, the first week in which we saw Jake Browning start at quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals, unfortunately, there wasn't much success in the running game. Joe Mixon had 8 carries for 16 yards and only 7 fantasy points by the end of the game. But as of late, over the course of the last 3 weeks with Jake Browning, as the Cincinnati Bengals team surrounded him and began to believe in Jake Browning, and know, okay, you know what, maybe we can make a run here, they've really scored a lot of points. Joe Mixon scored, 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games with Jake Browning. That is an incredible sight to see, especially considering prior to, Joe Burrow's injury, Joe Mixon was a, hit or miss kind of player every single week, but he's been hitting as of late. Now, as of late, we have also seen that the Pittsburgh Steelers, since the last time they took on the Cincinnati Bengals, have gone downhill very quickly as an offense and as a defense. Most recently, running backs against them have accumulated 368 rushing yards in just the last 3 games. Indianapolis Colts running backs combined for 28.5 fantasy points last week. New England Patriots, 25.7, and Arizona Cardinals, 24.5. My assumption is that Joe Mixon, Chase Brown should have themselves great performances this week. Our number 7 for this week is Alvin Kamara, who continues to put up RB1 performances every single week, even without a touchdown. In a half PPR last week with 13.5 fantasy points without a touchdown, still the RB12 within the given week. Coming off a performance in which he had 21 total touches, over 100 all-purpose yards, and unfortunately wasn't able to find the end zone, but eventually that'll take place. Going up against the Los Angeles Rams this week, it isn't the easiest matchup. Most recently, we have seen running backs, Washington Commanders running backs, only 48 rushing yards. Baltimore running backs, only 69. Cleveland with only 87. And Arizona with only 61. Running backs have not found a lot of success. None of those running backs scoring a touchdown in each of the last 4 performances against the LA Rams defense. But hopefully, in the absence of these receiving targets like Chris Olave and Michael Thomas, Alvin Kamara will get himself far more receiving utilization to elevate his overall performance. Number 8 for this week is Jonathan Taylor. Like I mentioned earlier, I am assuming that he's going to be healthy and ready to go, especially considering Zach Moss in the game against the Pittsburgh Steelers left with a shoulder injury. I know that Zach Moss said that he's hoping to potentially play this week, but the chances are, considering he left that game and didn't return, the chances are that Zach Moss is not going to be active. And hopefully we can get Jonathan Taylor practicing this week and ready to go by the time they take on the Atlanta Falcons, a defense that has yet to allow a rushing touchdown to an opposing running back. But this isn't the first time that Jonathan Taylor has taken on a difficult matchup in this circumstance. Earlier this season, prior to taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, that was a defense that hadn't allowed a rushing touchdown to an opposing running back all season long. Then they took on Jonathan Taylor, and he scored 2 against them. He is a capable running back, one of the best in the league. This is a run-first offense. They quite literally ran the ball 32 times with their running backs in last Saturday's game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's a running back that prior to his injury from week 7 through 12 was averaging 17.2 attempts per game, 75.4 rushing yards per game, 2.4 targets, 2.0 receptions, 15 receiving yards, so a total of over 90 yards per game, scoring a touchdown per game, 0.8 on the ground, 0.2 through the air, so 1 touchdown per game, and over 16 fantasy points per game. The assumption is an incredible overall performance this week if he's ready to go. Our number 9 for this week is Tony Pollard, taking on the Miami Dolphins. Now, the Miami Dolphins defense is no joke. They have played really well in terms of stopping the run as of late, regardless of which running backs they're taking on. Of course, they're allowing only 3.5 yards per carry since week 5 to opposing running backs, and we have to hope that the Dallas Cowboys that we saw travel to Buffalo don't get on the same plane and travel down to Miami, because otherwise we're going to be in a lot of trouble, especially in a negative game script. Now, of course, Tony Pollard has got himself a lot of utilization through the air as of late, and his rushing usage in the Buffalo Bills game wasn't terrible. 11 carries for 52 rushing yards was quite efficient in his overall opportunities. It's just a matter of the game getting away from them and not being able to run the ball in majority of that second half. Therefore, hopefully this is going to be a closer matchup. Hopefully a shootout between these two high-powered teams, both teams who are trying to clinch their divisions. I would assume this could be a shootout, and hopefully Tony Pollard, especially considering he's associated with such an elite offense, can fall into the end zone this week because, again, like I've mentioned in the past, touchdowns cure everything. On number 10 is Josh Jacobs. Again, this is the assumption that he is going to be healthy, considering he missed last week's game against the Los Angeles Chargers because it was a short week going from Sunday in which he injured his quad going to Thursday. There wasn't really much of an expectation of him playing. In his absence, of course, Jahmyr White, Amir Abdullah, Brandon Bolden, everybody had success for this offense. I mean, they scored a franchise record of 60 plus points. So going into this week, hopefully that Josh Jacobs, after another 10 days of rest, is available to take on the Kansas City Chiefs. Last time out against the Kansas City Chiefs, week 12. In that game, 20 carries for 110 yards and a rushing touchdown, 6 targets, 4 catches, 15 receiving yards, 20.5 half PPR fantasy points. Had himself a 63-yard rushing touchdown against that defense. And as of late, from what we've witnessed from the Kansas City Chiefs, they are not the Chiefs that teams have feared in the past. People can go into Kansas City and punch them in the mouth, and I expect Josh Jacobs and the Las Vegas Raiders, coming off of a huge week in which they've built confidence, to be able to do so. If, in fact, Josh Jacobs is not active and not available, Jahmyr White is the next man up. Make sure to have your handcuff on roster. Moving on to our number 11, speaking of the Kansas City Chiefs, hopefully they can get Isiah Pacheco back because he really was the tone setter for that offense and the running game. When we go back to week 12 against the Las Vegas Raiders, in that performance, Isiah Pacheco, 15 carries for 55 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, had himself 5 targets, 5 catches, 34 receiving yards, and 23.4 half PPR fantasy points. An incredible game. Even the last game prior to his shoulder injury, in which he, of course, required surgery, had himself 18 carries for 110 and a rushing touchdown, 4 targets, 3 catches, 13 receiving yards, 19.8 fantasy points against the Green Bay Packers. Of course, an incredible overall performance. And in the last 2 games in which we saw Isiah Pacheco was consistently at the top of the running back conversation. So hopefully he can return healthy and ready to go. And CEH and Jerick McKinnon aren't going to dig into his work, because we saw both CEH and Jerick McKinnon prove themselves to be competent enough replacements in which they can put up fantasy points. I mean, the duo combined for over 32 fantasy points against the New England Patriots. They may get more workload of opportunity, especially considering Pacheco's off the injury, but we'll have to keep an eye on the practice report. And if in fact anything changes, rankings are subject to change. Our number 12 for this week, to close out the RB1 conversation, is Kenneth Walker. Finally, the Seattle Seahawks decided, hey, let's get our workhorse running back the ball a consistent volume of times. They finally got back to giving the ball 20 plus times, which is all that we can possibly ask for. And of course, he delivered 19 carries for 86 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 3 receptions for 26 receiving yards against the Philadelphia Eagles, who have, over the course of this season, had a great run-stopping defense. Now, as of late, of course, have struggled in that overall circumstance, but Kenneth Walker luckily was able to take advantage of the opportunity. This week, they take on the Tennessee Titans. This is one of the easiest matchups they could possibly ask for. Since week 5, they're the 6th best matchup, allowing 4.16 yards per carry to opposing running backs and nearly 15 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. Now, in the last 2 games, the Tennessee Titans have given up 28 carries for 141 to Houston Texans running backs and 28 carries for 143 and 2 touchdowns to Miami Dolphins running backs. My assumption would be that Kenneth Walker should be able to put up another great performance here against the Tennessee Titans run-stop defense. On number 13, speaking of the Tennessee Titans, is Derrick Henry. I want to first and foremost read you guys a stat that I'm sure many of you have potentially heard in the last couple of days that I saw on Twitter. It reads, Derrick Henry, in his performance of 20 total touches last week against the Houston Texans, is the first player in NFL history to have 20 touches or more in a game in which they had less than 15 total yards. First player in NFL history. Now, I honestly want to know how many people who are currently watching this section of the video that have Derrick Henry have somehow advanced to the second round while not having a first round bye. If you had a first round bye because you were top 2 seed, congratulations. fantastic. You dodged a bullet. But for those of you who had Derrick Henry, I think the advance rate going to the next round of your fantasy playoffs is probably pretty low unless you had some monsters carrying your team. Nonetheless, Derrick Henry is still in this RB2 conversation for me going into week 16 because of what his overall opportunity share was and his overall efforts potentially against the Seattle Seahawks will look like. The Seattle Seahawks since week 5 are the 4th best matchup at the position. They're allowing 16.26 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. Most recently, Philadelphia Eagles running backs 95 rushing yards. San Francisco 165 and a touchdown. Dallas 83 and a touchdown. San Francisco again with 150 and 2 touchdowns. LA Rams with 74 and a touchdown. Baltimore for 230 and 3 touchdowns. We have seen teams week over week put up a high volume of overall yardage. If it wasn't for the fact that Will Levis stole that touchdown from Derrick Henry quite literally on the 1 yard line, following him into the end zone on that read option, he would have had himself at least 9 fantasy points and a half PPR, could have potentially saved our overall seasons, but nonetheless, going into this week, I think the matchup is good enough for Derrick Henry to ball out. I mean, we're coming to the final days of Derrick Henry as a Tennessee Titan, and I'm assuming they're going to run him into the ground and let him kind of lay out his legacy for the future. Our number 14 for this week is Bijan Robinson. Bijan Robinson, man. I mean, anytime I talk about Bijan Robinson, it is purely either, hey, he's getting himself opportunity, or man, do we hate Arthur Smith? Because unfortunately, last week, only had himself 8 total touches, 7 on the ground for 11 yards. Unfortunately, fumbled in that game, which led to 3 points for the Carolina Panthers. But, late in that game, they began to just really give the ball to Tyler Algier and Cordero Patterson. I mean, Cordero Patterson was given the rushing touchdown. They could have very easily given the ball to Bijan Robinson on that little motion jet sweep in which they pass it forward. They could have very easily gotten Bijan Robinson incorporated within that role, but they decided to give it to Cordero Patterson. And that is the issue that I have. Why not give your best running back the ball on a consistent basis, especially against the Carolina Panthers in a run game? This week, they do take on the Indianapolis Colts. Technically, they're the 2nd best matchup since week 5. They're allowing nearly 17 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. I would hope that Arthur Smith can figure it out, but don't be surprised if he ends up hurting Bijan Robinson once again with a lack of opportunities. Our number 15 is Jahmyr Gibbs, another one of these rookie running backs who was selected in the first round of the 2023 season. Jahmyr Gibbs coming off a great performance in which he scored 2 touchdowns. As an offense, the Detroit Lions lit it up. They had themselves 6 total touchdowns as a team, 5 passing, 1 rushing. Of course, the 1 rushing touchdown went to Jahmyr Gibbs, had himself 11 carries for 100 rushing yards. Since week 10, since the return of David Montgomery from his injury, we have seen Jahmyr Gibbs score himself 6 total touchdowns in 6 games, and he's averaging 6.24 yards per attempt. He's also averaging 14 touches per game. What more can we ask for? Yes, in some circumstances, when he doesn't score a touchdown, he's an RB3. But when he finds the end zone on a consistent basis, typically we find ourselves with an RB1 performance, which we're hoping for taking on the Minnesota Vikings this week. Our number 16 is David Montgomery. In the same overall vein, in weeks in which Jahmyr Gibbs will score a touchdown, David Montgomery may not. And the opposite could very easily exist. Now, hopefully we can get a week in which both of them find themselves in the end zone and are both fantasy relevant. But this is back-to-back weeks which we have unfortunately seen David Montgomery without a touchdown. But throughout the span of time, weeks 10 through 15, since he has returned from his injury, he's averaging 5.6 yards per carry. He's been highly efficient. And who would have guessed that the Detroit Lions offense, who's scored, 8 total touchdowns in the last 2 games, would have had an offense in which David Montgomery didn't find the end zone once throughout those 8 overall touchdowns. That is a surprise. If you had told me they were going to score 8 touchdowns, I would have said, all right, at least 2 of them are going towards David Montgomery. That has not been the case. But we really can't complain with his overall workload opportunity. He played more snaps than Jahmyr Gibbs in last Saturday's game against the Denver Broncos. He had himself 17 carries on the ground, 2 receptions, 19 total touches. All he needs to do is find the end zone, and he's good to go. Our number 17 for this week is Chuba Hubbard. Chuba Hubbard takes on the Green Bay Packers. It is one of the more advantageous matchups you can possibly ask for. The Green Bay Packers, since week 5, are allowing 14.96 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated, 4.44 yards per carry, and they are the 7th best matchup. Most recently, these are the fantasy point totals of running backs who have taken on the Green Bay Packers. Najee Harris, 17.1. Jaylen Warren, 18.0. David Montgomery, 15.1. Isiah Pacheco, 19.8. Saquon Barkley, 21.6. And Rachaad White with 20.9. Running backs have dominated against this defense. And Chuba Hubbard, who has been given 25, 23, and 22 rushing attempts in the last 3 games since the coaching change, he is the RB1 of this team. He is getting himself elite levels of opportunity and has an absolute advantageous matchup to potentially have himself a 20-plus point game within the given week. On number 18, to begin the E tier, is Breece Hall. Now, Breece Hall obviously is coming off a really underwhelming performance of 6 rushing attempts for 12 yards, only 1 reception, which is quite alarming. Obviously, the change from Zach Wilson to Trevor Siemian made a huge difference in terms of his overall usage. Only playing 40% of the offensive snaps wasn't really a surprise considering the game got out of hand. And why use Breece Hall when you can just potentially keep him healthy and move on to the next game? Well, going into this week, week 16, we know that Aaron Rodgers is not in the overall equation. He had already said earlier today on the Pat McAfee show that he is not going to be ready for another 3 weeks, 4 weeks potentially. So he is out of the entire equation for this season in the New York Jets offense, which is fantastic. Hopefully he'll be healthy to begin next season. But going into this week, Breece Hall has an opportunity of getting back on track, potentially against the Washington Commanders. Their defense has been slaughtered by running backs in terms of fantasy points scored as of late. Let me just go ahead and give you a rundown. Kyren Williams, 22 points. Mostert, 11.6, while Achane in that same game, 23.8. Pollard, 19.3. Saquon, 28.0. Kenneth Walker, 19.2. Ramondre Stevenson, 20.9. DeAndre Swift, 13.4. And Saquon Barkley again with 17.3. Running backs have dominated against the Washington Commanders. Hopefully, Breece Hall can do the same to advance us to the fantasy football championships. Our number 19 for this week is Devin Singletary. Over the course of the last 2 games, we have seen Dameon Pierce with 5 rushing attempts for 12 rushing yards. In that same span of time, Devin Singletary accumulated 39 rushing attempts for 186 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown. He's coming off a performance even with Case Keenum in which he played 75% of the offensive snaps, also got himself besides the 120 rushing yards, 4 receptions for 49 receiving yards. Now gets CJ Stroud back, potentially Nico Collins back. This is a playoff team in Brown, considering their current record, taking on the Cleveland Browns, which is another team that is vying for a wild card position. This is going to be a competitive game, and hopefully Devin Singletary is given an ample share of opportunity, which I'm expecting. Again, he's coming off a week in which he literally had 30 total touches. That's the second time that's happened this season already. Moving on to my number 20, we have Ezekiel Elliott of the New England Patriots. Unfortunately, had himself an underwhelming performance of only 7.1 half PPR fantasy points, but the opportunity was there. Had 16 total touches, but wasn't able to get himself the ever-elusive touchdown. And like I've mentioned in the past, touchdowns cure everything. But another running back within this offense stole that rushing touchdown. Late in that game, after the Kadarius Toney interception kind of tipped pass, we saw Kevin Harris as the running back on first down. They threw the ball to Demario Douglas. He gets a first down on that play. Then Kevin Harris, the following play, runs it up the middle for 15 yards and scores a touchdown. Now, I can't objectively say that Kevin Harris stole the touchdown from Ezekiel Elliott, but rather he stole the opportunity of scoring that potential touchdown. But that being said, even if you go back and watch that game, there were multiple instances early in that game and early in those drives in which Ezekiel Elliott was given great blocking in front of him. It was him in the safety. All he needed to do is make the defender miss or run through him or run around him, and he could have very easily scored a touchdown and had himself double-digit fantasy points easily within the overall game, playing 87% of the offensive snaps. They take on the Denver Broncos this week, the 8th best matchup, allowing 5.42 yards per carry since week 5 and nearly 15 fantasy points per game. I still believe that Ezekiel Elliott is a fantastic option, assuming, of course, Ramondre Stevenson is not back with that ankle. Our number 21 is Travis Etienne. I am currently ranking Travis Etienne under the assumption that Trevor Lawrence is not able to clear the concussion protocol. Only 2 players, to my knowledge, on the offensive side of the ball this season have been able to clear the concussion protocol and play within 5 days. That has been Derek Carr and Brock Purdy. Other than that, I mean, we just went back to last week. CJ Stroud wasn't able to clear the concussion protocol. So if we're going to be in a scenario in which, of course, Trevor Lawrence is not available, then Travis Etienne taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which is already a tough matchup, is not in the best overall position to succeed. Now, Trevor Lawrence potentially does end up clearing the concussion protocol, which again is typically rare. I would say, all right, let's fire up Travis Etienne at a far higher ranking than where I currently have him. That is why we have ranking subject to change. He is someone that is continuing to get the ball on the ground a consistent volume of times. He's had himself, 4+ receptions in each of the last 4 games, and he always has the ability to score a touchdown. Obviously, this offense turned over the ball a lot against the Baltimore Ravens, missed a lot of field goals. If they can get back on track and Trevor Lawrence is potentially healthy, I will rank Travis Etienne a little bit higher than he currently is. Moving on to our 22, and to begin the F tier, we have Devon Achane. Devon Achane, back-to-back weeks of 12 total touches. Now, 12 touches with Devon Achane, considering how efficient he has been throughout his entire career, is enough to be fantasy relevant. But as of late, Raheem Mostert is absorbing all of the touchdowns possible. Now, at this current moment in time, over the course of the last 2 weeks, we have seen Achane finish as the number 26 running back and number 23 running back. He is pretty much a low-end RB2, high-end RB3. But if in fact he's able to score a touchdown, he is in the top 15 RB conversation in every single circumstance. So I'm going to rank him as a lower-end RB2, under the assumption that, of course, we continue to see Raheem Mostert absorb touchdowns. Again, Raheem Mostert has scored himself quite literally 7 touchdowns on the ground in just the last 4 games. If that continues to go in his direction against the Dallas Cowboys, again, it's going to hurt Achane's upside, but nonetheless, he is still getting himself enough volume and enough fantasy points to be a low-end RB2 with potential for upside. Our number 23 is DeAndre Swift. Now, here's the thing about DeAndre Swift. I think he played a lot better yesterday. 74 rushing yards, was giving himself finally 20 total touches once again. Workhorse level of opportunity. But this week they take on the New York Giants. And when we talk about the Eagles versus the Giants, we have to talk about the Giants Slayer. Again, Giants Slayer. That is Boston Scott. In each of the last 9 games he has played against the New York Giants, whether it's regular season or postseason, he has scored 1 touchdown minimum. He has scored in his entire career 11 touchdowns against the New York Giants in just the last 9 games. Last season was able to do it in all 3 contests, whether it was the 2 regular season games or the one in the postseason. It does not matter. Boston Scott is going to get himself opportunity. And if in fact they allow him to score a touchdown for the sake of continuing this streak of being the Giants Slayer, of course, DeAndre Swift could end up hurting in this overall circumstance. Nonetheless, this is a top 5 matchup at the position. They're allowing over 15 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated since week 5. Our number 24 in the same matchup is Saquon Barkley. The issue that I have with Saquon Barkley is the fact that this offense is eventually going to be exposed. They were last week by the New Orleans Saints and once again could end up taking place this week against the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, the Philadelphia Eagles are on a 3-game losing streak. They have struggled heavily and they've played against some pretty tough teams. Now, in terms of stopping the run, they have struggled a lot, considering the fact that they gave up 102 rushing yards and a touchdown to Seattle Seahawks running backs, 105 and a touchdown to Dallas Cowboys running backs, and 116 and a touchdown on the ground to San Francisco running backs. There is a possibility in which Saquon Barkley could put up a great performance. But the difference is, can Tommy DeVito carry this team against the Philadelphia Eagles? Can he continue to move the chains? If he's able to, sure, we're in the realm of possibility in which Saquon Barkley could have himself a breakout performance. But there's always the possibility in which he can come up with another performance in which he did last week, when he only has 9 carries for 14 yards and 4.7 fantasy points by the end of the week, because we have seen it from last year's performances against that defense. Our number 25 is Aaron Jones. Now, I know that on Sunday morning, many of you guys had said very late in that stream, hey, Andrew, we heard that Matt LaFleur said that he was only going to give Aaron Jones 10 to 15 to 20 overall snaps within the overall game. And I told you guys, hey, if you want to go ahead and bench Aaron Jones, fine. But there is no reason for Matt LaFleur, the head coach and the primary play caller of the offense, to give a tip to the world that, hey, we're not going to use Aaron Jones. Because A.J. Dillon was out, and they had to use Aaron Jones. That was a given. There's a reason why Aaron Jones played 48% of the offensive snaps, played 30 overall snaps altogether. Again, twice as many as was being projected or was being kind of announced within those overall kind of Sunday morning rumors. Again, you got to really, vet those rumors, because if you don't, it could really hurt you. Either way, in the overall opportunities that Aaron Jones was given, he ended up getting himself 13 touches for 53, 4 receptions for 16, 17 total touches since returning from his injury. Great. If we're going to be in a situation in which, of course, A.J. Dillon, who's dealing with a broken thumb, is not able to return, taking on the Carolina Panthers, the 3rd best matchup at the position, this should be a dominant performance here from Aaron Jones within the overall week. Our number 26 is James Conner. I would love to rank James Conner a little bit higher, but the Bears matchup truly does concern me. Since week 5, the Bears are only allowing 7.23 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated, and are only allowing 3.39 yards per attempt to opposing running backs. They are quite literally the toughest matchup since week 5 in the last 10 games amongst all teams in the league. Therefore, James Conner, who's had himself back-to-back great performances of 16.4 and 22.5 fantasy points, who's gotten himself 25 and 17 touches, and there really has been an emphasis to get him the ball, may not be the best overall play against this Bears defense, who has played incredibly well, who is causing a lot of turnovers. And if in fact they can grant themselves a lead, considering how bad the Arizona Cardinals defense has played, maybe there's a conversation in which James Conner isn't the best overall play. That being said, they are giving him enough opportunity to where he is still a low-end RB2, high-end RB3, with the potential he finds the end zone. If he's not able to, the running game isn't intact, considering how great this run-stop defense is. Of course, that is why we have him at 26. On number 27 is Ty Chandler. Now, Ty Chandler is coming off a monster performance. I mentioned it yesterday in regards to waiver wire pickups. 10.6 fantasy points in just the first drive alone within his overall workload of opportunity. Obviously, scored himself a touchdown, got himself receiving and rushing work, and that's only going to continue. The question is, can they do the same against the Detroit Lions, a defense that has played very well in terms of stopping the run, only allowing 3.69 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs since week 5. Of course, Ty Chandler is going to be featured within this backfield with the absence of Alexander Mattison. He'll get himself the rushing work, the receiving work. It's just a matter of, can Nick Mullins in this offense get him near the goal line and have him plug it in for a touchdown? It's always in the realm of possibility. We almost saw Javonte Williams do it, but of course, Russell Wilson later in that game stole it. Moving on to our number 28, we have Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren in week 12 against the Cincinnati Bengals didn't have the greatest overall performance, 5.7 fantasy points. But most recently, we have seen running backs dominate against the Cincinnati Bengals, one being Ty Chandler, who I just mentioned, coming off a week in which he had 23 for 132 yards and a touchdown. Travis Etienne, 11 for 45 and a touchdown. Gus Edwards, 12 for 62 and 2 touchdowns. And Devin Singletary with 30 carries for 150 and a touchdown. Jaylen Warren hopefully is going to get himself more and more opportunity. We saw that after Najee Harris fumbled the ball, a lot of the overall snaps and touches went in the direction of Jaylen Warren. 10 carries for 40 yards, 5 catches for 28, 70% of the offensive snaps. The quarterback change is going to take place going to Mason Rudolph, and potentially in a negative game script, Najee Harris is most likely not going to be on the field. Moving on to our number 29, Gus Edwards. In the absence of Keaton Mitchell due to the season-ending injury, Edwards is relevant once again for fantasy purposes. Of course, earlier this season, there was a 5-game stretch in which he scored 9 rushing touchdowns. So if we can get back to that overall equation, coming off a week in which he had 58 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, 13.4 fantasy points, even though they take on the San Francisco 49ers, this 49ers front 7 is injured, dealing with a lot of injuries on their defensive line. Hargrave and Ark Armstead were both missing last week, and there's a reason why the Arizona Cardinals were able to run the ball 21 times for 177 and 2 rushing touchdowns from their running backs. There's always the realm of possibility in which Gus Edwards could put up a great performance here in a very competitive matchup. On number 20 is Javonte Williams. Now, I've mentioned it in the past. Touchdowns cure everything, but in the case of Javonte Williams, someone who has only had 1 rushing touchdown all season long, truly has struggled to find himself continuing to get in the end zone on a weekly basis. Now, he had himself a rushing attempt on the 1-yard line. He didn't score, and that's on him, and that's on the offensive line. There was another play in that game in which they had a fullback dive. Scored a touchdown, called back due to a penalty because one of the offensive guards was lined up in the neutral zone. And then we had Russell Wilson scoring himself his 3rd rushing touchdown in the last 4 games, stealing it from Javonte Williams. It happens. And this week they take on the New England Patriots. The Patriots have played very well in terms of stopping the run as of late. Running back performances against the New England Patriots in the last 4 games. Kansas City, only 48 rushing yards. Pittsburgh, only 40 rushing yards. Los Angeles Chargers, only 34 rushing yards. New York Giants, only 52 rushing yards. Again, Javonte Williams not in the best position to succeed this week. Now, speaking of the Los Angeles Chargers, let's talk about Austin Ekeler. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Austin Ekeler is in the H tier, my number 31. I didn't think I'd ever get to this position, but it's time. With no Justin Herbert, with a new head coach going into this week, Austin Ekeler may not be the priority of this team. He may not even play very much, considering, again, they're not really playing for a playoff spot. They're just playing for kind of pride, potentially reaching overall kind of incentives, whether it's like, oh, gain yourself over 1,000 all-purpose yards, score yourself double-digit touchdowns, whatever's in their contract. But I don't want to go ahead and say that Austin Ekeler is not a competitor because we know he is, but they're taking on the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills seem to be on a mission, and they're trending upwards while the Chargers are trending, really, they're nosediving at this point. So if this game script is going to be a negative one and they're going to ignore the running game and it's going to be a pass-heavy approach and they're not looking in the direction of Austin Ekeler very much, how can we potentially trust them in this given week? If you had Austin Ekeler and you somehow got past the first round of your fantasy playoffs, congratulations. Perhaps this is not going to be the week to utilize him for success. Number 32 is Najee Harris. Now, again, like I mentioned earlier with Jaylen Warren, if in fact this game is going to be a negative game script, considering they're taking on Cincinnati and they have Mason Rudolph as their starting quarterback, perhaps Najee Harris might not get himself a lot of utilization. He's coming off a week in which he was benched because of a fumble. Obviously, Jaylen Warren really took care of majority of the overall touches in that second half. And even though Najee Harris is coming off a performance in which he put up nearly 16 fantasy points last time out in week 12 against the Cincinnati Bengals, there's been a lot of time between then and now that has really pushed Najee Harris to a point where, really, can we trust him? I don't think so. At this point, even though this is an advantageous matchup, I don't really trust Najee Harris to be able to deliver a great performance unless he's guaranteed a touchdown, which, again, we know in fantasy is not the case. Moving on to our 33, we have Bijan Robinson Jr. If, in fact, he's able to return from his hamstring injury, I'd be more than happy to play him at an RB3 capacity. As of late, Sam Howell has scored himself 4 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 games he has played with Brian Robinson Jr., which has certainly hurt his overall potential for upside. And considering they take on the Jets, I know this is a somewhat advantageous matchup, 11th best since week 5. Even that being the case, I don't trust Brian Robinson to be given enough opportunity in this offense that loves to throw the ball as much as they do. Jerome Ford is our number 34, still the RB1 of this team, but outside of his receiving work, really is going to be nullified within this game against the Houston Texans, a defense that is the second toughest matchup, only allowing 2.85 yards per attempt and less than 8 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics. Isolated, we know that they prefer Kareem Hunt as the overall goal line back, so Jerome Ford a lesser option within the given week. Moving on to the I tier to close out today's episode, we begin with Chase Brown. Like I mentioned with Joe Mixon earlier, the Pittsburgh Steelers have allowed 368 rushing yards in the last 3 games. The fantasy running back performances as of the last 3 games: Indianapolis Colts combined for 28.5, New England 25.7, and Arizona 24.5. So why not Chase Brown and Joe Mixon having themselves a great overall performance? Hopefully Chase Brown is healthy for the contest. On number 36 is Roschon Johnson. Under the assumption that Roschon Johnson is given the vast majority of touches, of course he could be the relevant back, but I don't trust that immediately D'Onta Foreman isn't going to be utilized, and neither is Khalil Herbert. I think this is truly just a running back by committee, and the reason why Roschon Johnson really did get himself a lot of touches was because of the fact that every single rushing attempt from D'Onta Foreman and or Khalil Herbert were either 1 to 2 yards, 0 yards, or fat negative yards. And that's why the Chicago Bears began to position themselves into getting more touches in the receiving game for Roschon Johnson, because why waste your time running the ball against the Cleveland Browns? Otherwise, this week, I would love to trust Roschon Johnson more. I just can't do it, even though it is the best matchup at the position. The final player I wanted to mention is Tyjae Spears. If, in fact, we're in a position in which they continue to sprinkle him with targets in the receiving game, in a negative game script, potentially on hand, depending on who's going to play quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks, he could be a value. He's pretty much just an honorable mention at number 37 for those of you who are in need or a desperate need of a running back play. Okay, guys, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you haven't yet already, click the like button, subscribe if you have not yet already as well. Greatly appreciate it. I'll be back with wide receiver rankings tomorrow, quarterback and tight end on Thursday. Friday, we'll probably have a live stream prior to the Saturday morning live stream, Sunday morning live stream, and probably a Monday afternoon live stream on Christmas Day. Happy holidays. Hope you guys are doing well. Best of luck this week. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.